I'm Saurav Chaudhary, founder of CSG Advisory. Welcome to another episode of Be Beta, Be Unbeatable, a podcast series that brings together go-to-market practitioners from the B2B world and shares their journey to achieve commercial excellence. Today, we have a dear friend and an accomplished sales coach, Brent Marcombe, Director, Growline Group, is joining us from Melbourne, Australia. Brent brings deep expertise in working with sales leaders and organizations across the globe to help improve their sales productivity. We are also honored to have him as a member of our advisory board here at CSG Advisory. Welcome, Brent. Great to have you with us and looking forward to an engaging conversation around sales performance and productivity.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for the opportunity to have a chat. Looking forward to it as well.
Thanks, Brent. To get you started, let's talk a little bit about Growline Group and your role at Growline Group.
Sure. We're a boutique training consultancy based out of Melbourne, and I'm one of the founding directors of that business, along with my business partner, Robert Plant. We, had both been in training consultancy for, probably between 15 and 20 years between us or each. And we wanted to make sure we had a consultancy that really enabled us to work on the projects that we felt would make a meaningful and significant contribution to our clients' business, to their top and bottom line. And that's actually where the name of the company came from. Growline Group sort of comes from growing that top and bottom line. We've been around for about 7 years now and having a great time working with the clients that we know well and enjoy working with and helping them grow their business.
Very interestingly, I didn't know that the rationale behind the Growline name was growing your top line and bottom line. So that's good to know, even though I have known you over a decade now. So there's always something new to learn or come across, I guess.
There's always a surprise, Sarah, always a surprise in store.
Yes, that's good. That's good. As you talked about, focusing on the sales domain, and especially if I understand correctly, a lot of it has been in the B2B selling. Now, this is a space which has seen a lot of changes in the recent past, right? With the proliferation of digital, new business models coming into place. So from your lens, what have you seen on the client side in terms of this evolution taking place?
You're right. It has been an interesting decade. It's been a really dynamic decade in many ways. I think of it like, if I think of the last 10 years, I really think of it as the decade of insight. It's actually about 10 years since Brent Adamson published The Challenger Sale, and I know you're familiar with it. But for everyone listening, Adamson's basic premise, I guess, this is my interpretation of it, was that digitisation and that ubiquitous availability of information had changed the game. So it meant that customers have got access to the information they need to make buying decisions. So in some ways they need sellers less and less. And he presented some data that showed that sellers were getting engaged much later in the sales cycle as a result of that, often once customers had made a decision about what they needed. By the same token, sellers have got access to a whole host of information that enables them to answer many of the questions that prior to this decade they'd been taught to ask customers as part of a solution selling approach. So in other words, they've got the information to answer the questions, and if they still ask those questions of their customers, of course their customers are thinking, well, hang on, these are pretty pointless questions that are wasting my time. So it's been a decade of insight. Start working out how you can bring insight to your customers to create real value and to sort of disrupt that approach they've got where they can start to make buying decisions without engaging with the sellers. So yes, that premise has been around for a decade, but we think it's just as relevant and in fact potentially more relevant than it was when it was first talked about 10 years ago. we're seeing ever-increasing speed of change. We're seeing ever-increasing availability of information. And, of course, digital transformation and the ability to take advantage of the digital economy is more topical than ever. And so the ability to bring insight to customers is still really, really critical. And what we're seeing in the clients that we work with, that some of them are embracing that and having very different types of discussions with their customers where, they're adding genuine business value. In other industries and with some sales teams, we still see that old behaviour that focuses on talking very much about themselves, talking about their products and services. And, they're wondering why their customers are turning to alternative suppliers. So that ability to bring insight, really, really, really critical. There's another interesting trend that we're seeing in the marketplace in the last couple of years, and that is that customers have become very, very focused on price, and this is making it really challenging for many B2B sales teams. I think it was Alex Gorski, he was or still is actually, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, the global pharma. He coined this expression. He said, we all need to behave as if Amazon is coming after us, whether you're a direct competitor with Amazon or not. And of course, what he was talking about was just the explosion in the digital economy. And I know IDC forecast that about 65% of global GDP will be digitised by 2023. And just about every customer out there now, every business out there is embracing digital transformation to take advantage of that digital economy, to remain relevant for the way their customers want to buy. So to enable them to focus on that digital transformation, they're really looking very deeply at their spend on operations versus innovation. And they're trying to start to flip that. They're actually trying to make savings on the operational side to invest more in innovation. So that, I think, is where this focus on price is coming from, as organisations are seeking to free up resource to invest in innovation. And it's kind of supported by the data too. I was looking the other day at some research that was published by Accenture, and they went to B2B buyers who had switched suppliers. And they presented them with a range of different choices as to what motivated them to switch suppliers. What they found out was that some of the traditional things that we once felt would motivate B2B buyers to swap suppliers aren't as relevant anymore. So, for example, the ability to recommend solutions. This is once upon a time the bread and butter of the sales force, recommending the right solution. Well, in this list of motivators for change, it came in 8th. You would think that providing value for money for customers would be important in motivating them to stay or to change, respectively. Well, that came in 4th. Of course, the top motivator for change, price. So it's interesting, this concept of insight and price, I think, are linked. So once customers have decided what they want to buy, once they've decided what they need and what the right solution for them is, of course, they buy on price. So you've got this increased ability for customers to identify what they need and to make buying decisions without sellers, which means that by the time they engage the seller, there's a very strong focus on price. So this environment of digital transformation, ubiquitous availability of information, this really strong focus on price, if we can't work out a way to get engaged with customers early in their buying cycle, it becomes a really tricky environment for B2B sellers to manage.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you say that, right? I mean, in some sense, a bit counterintuitive to my understanding, right? Because uh, for the longest time, we have seen and even heard that if you are able to sort of articulate value, then price doesn't really remain that important a consideration, and that's where this whole idea of insight-led selling or point of view selling sort of emerged, right? Which will help you sort of overcome the pricing and discounting kind of conversation. But what you just said there is very interesting, and I wonder, right, when you talk about pricing, what we have also seen that now the decision makers on the buyer sides have increased, right? So it's not just the procurement or the line of business. I mean, we have procurement, line of business, CFO, uh, and other functions involved in that decision making. So who do you think is more sort of looking at price as that most important consideration, or is it sort of equitable across all these buying groups?
Well, I think there's a couple of topics there that you just raised, which again, I see as being linked. So, you mentioned the purchasing buyers, you mentioned line of business buyers, and another insight that the data supports that we know to be a fact is that there are more and more decision makers involved in buying decisions at customers. The decision-making process and therefore the selling process are becoming more complex on both the buyer and the seller's side. The second consideration is this sort of trade-off or this competition between price and value. The key thing is, when is the value introduced to the customer as they go through their buying cycle? If we don't get value in front of customers early enough in their buying cycle, if they have got to the point where they are convinced that they've identified the right solution that they need to purchase, of course, because they've got multiple stakeholders, there's that complexity in the background, they don't want to back up. So if we go to them with value too late in the sales cycle, it's too late. You've got to get that value in front of the buyers early in the sales cycle, so we're not asking them to back up too far in that buying process, because it's just complicated to do it. And so value's still important, but there's no point bringing that value to your customers when they're late in their buying cycle. You've got to get it in front of them early.
Yeah, that makes sense. So based on what you just mentioned, Brent, how are you taking these insights that you're coming across and changing the way perhaps Growline has approached coaching and working with the clients to improve their sales performance?
What we're seeing is that there's a group of clients who are managing these challenges that we've just discussed well. There's another group that are not doing so well. Now, as it transpires, and this is supported again by the data as well as what we're seeing with our clients, there's about a third of organisations that are actually doing well. They're significantly outperforming their peers. They've got higher deal win rates, higher quota achievement, higher business success. There's about 2/3 of organisations are on the wrong side of that divide. Now, when we start to look at their sales function and their sales model, they're not set up for success in this sort of very fast-moving digital world that we're talking about. Now, it's interesting, when you think about a business puts a lot of investment into making sure that they've got a really strong suite of professional capabilities in the C-suite, from a strategy perspective, from an operations perspective, from an IT and finance perspective. But the organisations that we see on the wrong side of the sales divide actually don't end up putting the same discipline into building a professional sales function. They tend to start to tolerate a lack of discipline, and a lack of excellence. They've got sales processes and I guess the way that they manage their deals, which is kind of fundamentally misaligned with the way customers are buying. Their sales efforts end up lacking transparency. They certainly become unpredictable, and the sales activities that they undertake are sort of very ad hoc in nature. And in many cases, we see examples of where salespeople are essentially left to make it up for themselves. Now, we've got an analogy that we think is very, very relevant for these organisations on the wrong side of that sales divide. We reckon that their sales function has become a black box. It lacks in transparency. It's ad hoc in nature. And those organisations where their sales function has become a black box, there's some really easy to spot symptoms that make it easy for us to see that their sales function's a black box, but also make it relatively easy for organisations to be a bit introspective and look at their own sales function. But things like losing unlosable deals, the ones you've already banked, salesperson's already spent the commission, and it turns out you don't win the deal, and often you don't even know why you've lost it. These organisations are often over-reliant on price, late in the sales cycle, really exposed to collapsing margins, and they really struggle to forecast their pipeline, forecast future sales accurately. And of course, that results in low win rates and lack of ability to achieve their sales targets. So in a way, when that sales function becomes a black box, the overall value chain of the business breaks down. It makes it really difficult for the other functions of the business to be able to perform their role successfully. And so you get this flow-on effect to what becomes sustained business underperformance. And so we see that quite a bit. But the good news is that there are some pretty straightforward ways that businesses can change that and can refresh their sales model, if you like, open the lid on that sales black box. So there is hope.
Certainly. Yeah, so just a continuation of that, do you want to touch upon a couple of aspects in terms of how the client should look at it? And you're right, I mean, it's a very interesting analogy, right? And we often read, in fact, mainly this behavior is seen in tech product-led companies where they believe that their engineering and product is so strong, they don't necessarily need a sales team or a sales organization. Initially, they will see a tick up in their sales and they are confident about it until they reach a stage where they can't scale up any further. And perhaps it's a bit too late to think about a sales organization and putting that team together. So how should customers think about avoiding this black box scenario?
I just want to pick up on a point you made, Sarah, which I thought was really interesting, in that organisations who are confident that they've got the right products or solutions that they essentially sell themselves. Yeah. One of the other things that's really interesting that's evolved really quickly in the last 10 years is that customers are actually looking beyond products and solutions now. And what in many industries are embracing is, rather than selling products and solutions, they're actually selling a completely new business model. So in the IT industry, infrastructure as a service is a good example, but there are many similar examples across different industries, both industrial as well as IT, and it's broadly being embraced. And so thinking that your products and solutions are going to sell themselves is a great way to perhaps end up with no sales, as the whole market moves to new innovative business models that you're unable to sell. Completely different buying group, completely different sales skill. Back to those organisations that want to lift the lid on their sales black box. The key thing is, and again, there's an interesting data point here that came from some research that Harvard Business School did, and they did some work on how to sell in a world that never stops changing. And their thesis was, well, you need a coherent sales model. Now, that sales model typically is made up of three components. The first part of the model is the ability to understand your target customer and their needs. And of course, that aligns from a sales perspective with finding opportunities. The second element of the model is absolute clarity on the process that customers use to make buying decisions, and therefore what needs to be done at each step of the process to help customers move through their buying process. And we know clients that are really good at that are the ones that have got the best deal win rates. The third element of that model is prioritizing selling time for the very best customers. That enables the selling organisation to maximise customer value and, importantly, be productive from a sales perspective. And those clients that are focused and good at that are best at growing their sales, growing their business. Now, to be honest, most organisations have defined their sales processes based on these three core components. But where the gap tends to be, where we find the gap when we work with our clients, is starting to peel the onion and say, do they have the really clearly defined, predictable, consistent, repeatable selling activities in each of the different areas of that model? Now, it's amazing how often the answer to that question is no. And inevitably, when the answer is no, they're the companies, they're the businesses who are on the wrong side of that sales divide that I spoke about. So the challenge that they've got, and this is where we end up helping many of our clients, is that they need to define the selling activities the organisation needs to consistently use, and of course the capabilities that their sellers need in order to undertake those activities, and they need to excel at them. So it sounds pretty easy for many organisations, much easier said than done. So what we've found works well, and this is where we differentiate ourselves with the clients we work with, is we've developed the concept of a reference sales model, and we call it the intentional sales model. Now, I won't go into the model in detail. It's based on a suite of 9 comprehensive sales methodologies that span the customer journey. And what it does is it gives organisations the reference they need to be able to, first of all, work out which element of their sales model needs refreshing and how do they go about ensuring they have those repeatable processes that they need for sustained sales success at each of those steps of the customer journey.
That sounds excellent. So we're coming towards the end, Brent, and in our audience, we also have a lot of young talent who are perhaps going to join the workforce or already in the workforce. So when they look at sales being a future for them, or B2B sales as a function, what is your advice to them in terms of building a career in this particular domain?
That's an interesting one, isn't it? Very often we find ourselves saying, if only I knew what I know now then. So maybe this is my opportunity to highlight a couple of things that I wish I had known when I set out in my sales career back in the late 1980s. Probably 3 things, Sarav. First thing would be mindset. Second thing would be approach. And the third thing would be, what will I call it? Let's call it relationships. First one was mindset. I'd really encourage those embracing a career in sales to come in with a growth mindset. So sure, but be confident about your abilities, but always remember there's something new to learn. The marketplace is evolving at an incredible pace. And so to stay relevant you have to embrace that change and you have to continually improve. There really isn't the opportunity to rest on your laurels. So it's not a case of coming into a sales role, going through the learning curve and saying, I'm done. If you want to be successful in sales long term, you're always going to be on that learning curve. The second thing I mentioned was approach. My advice would be, don't fall into the trap of making it up on the fly. I've seen lots of examples of salespeople who literally shoot from the hip. They don't really know what they're doing, what's in the best interest of their customers, but they're just prepared to make it up on the fly. So be aware, sales is as much a science as it is an art. So make sure you push your sales manager and the organisation you work for to find a robust sales model and methodologies that you can apply consistently so that you can be successful and productive as a salesperson. The third one I think I said was relationships. Find yourself a coach. Salespeople who've benefited from having a good coach outstrip their competitors, their colleagues who have not been able to find a coach every single time, because coaches can see things that you can't. Good coaches know things that you don't. So as you embrace that growth mindset, as you're on that learning curve, if you've got a good coach, you can skate up that learning curve so much more quickly.
That's excellent. And you make a very valid point there, right? I mean, it's like performance sports. The higher you go up in any sport, you still need a coach, you need a better coach, right? Why would that be any different when it comes to the professional context or in the corporate environment? This is where what we see at times is that some organizations become confident, bordering towards arrogance, saying that we don't need any outside help and we are self-sufficient because we are doing good. And I think that's the trap to avoid because there's always need for that outside counsel because we all have our blind sides, and it certainly helps for someone to come in and share that outside view. So I think that was a beautiful advice that you gave there.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Brent. We have covered a lot of ground here and some valuable advice for our audience around how to pursue the journey towards building a world-class sales organization. As always, great talking to you and hope to have you for another episode in the near future.
Thanks, Harav. Absolute pleasure. Enjoyed having a chat.
Thanks to the listeners for joining us. If you like what you have heard, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you and see you in our next episode.